Frankfurt, 1956. A man sits at a wooden desk in a quiet study, and it is late. The lamp on the desk throws a small circle of amber light across the pages in front of him. Outside the window, the city has gone dark, or as dark as cities go. He can hear, barely, the sound of a tram on a distant street. Then, nothing. He picks up his pen. The man's name is Erich Fromm. He is 56 years old. He has spent more than 3 decades listening in consulting rooms in New York, in Mexico, in the lecture halls of universities, to people describe the thing they want most, and failing to have it. They were not inarticulate people. They were not people who lacked insight. Many of them had built careful, considered lives, and still they arrived at the same broken door. They had tried to love. They could not explain what they had been doing wrong. Fromm had a theory. It was not a comfortable one. Tonight, over the next 3 hours, we will follow it. Let your body settle wherever it rests. The mattress beneath you, or the cushion, or the armchair in the corner. Notice where the weight falls. Let it stay there. You are not going anywhere. Nothing you hear tonight will ask you to change before morning. The thinking has already been done by a man in Frankfurt by lamplight 6 decades ago. You are simply receiving it now. There is a question Fromm was preparing to ask that night. It is one of those questions that sounds simple until you sit with it. The kind that seems like it should have an obvious answer until you realize that no one has actually taught you the answer at all. The question is this: if love is the most important thing in a human life, and almost everyone believes that it is, in some form, in some version, then why have you never been taught how to do it? Not the feeling, not the ache of falling or the grief of losing. Those come without instruction. But the practice, the discipline, the skill that is learned the way a musician learns an instrument, through return, through failure, through the willingness to go back to the same uncomfortable place and try once more with greater care. Fromm believed we had confused 2 things. We had confused love the feeling with love the practice. And that confusion, quiet as it is, undoes more lives than almost any other mistake we make. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath move through you without effort. You do not need to manage it. There are 2 kinds of tiredness, and you may be carrying the second. Not the kind the body asks for, the kind that sleep fixes, but the other one. The tiredness of having tried for years in ways that did not quite work, without ever being told what was missing from the attempt. We will get closer to the second kind as the night goes on. Here is the small detail that changes everything. Fromm did not believe that love was rare or that most people were incapable of it. He believed the opposite. He believed the capacity was nearly universal. What was missing was not the feeling and not the desire. What was missing was the practice, the instruction, the understanding that this was something that could be learned. A musician who has never been taught will not play beautifully, no matter how much they feel the music. A surgeon who has never trained will not cut cleanly, no matter how much they want the patient to survive. Why do we assume that love, this most complex, most delicate, most consequential of all human skills, should be exempt from the need to learn? Fromm did not know exactly how to answer that question on the night he picked up his pen. He spent the next months trying. What he wrote became The Art of Loving, published in 1956. It has sold more than 25 million copies. It has never, in 68 years, gone out of print. The room is quiet now. Frankfurt is a long time ago, but the question that started there is still here, in the dark, asking to be held. We begin where he began. Not with an answer, with a willingness to look. Chapter 2, What We Were Never Taught. Erich Fromm was born in Frankfurt in 1900, the only child of an Orthodox Jewish family. His father, Naphtali, was a wine merchant. The household was serious and studious, steeped in Talmudic study and the long tradition of argument about what a good life required. Fromm would say later that he grew up surrounded by books and questions about how to live, and very little conversation about whether the people in those books were happy. He trained first as a sociologist in Heidelberg under Alfred Weber, the younger brother of Max. Then psychoanalysis claimed him. He completed his training at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute in the late 1920s. He read Freud with the urgency of a young man who has found a language for something he already dimly felt. He also read the early Marx, not the Marx of political programs, but the humanist philosopher who asked what industrial labor did to the person who performed it 8 hours a day, every day of their life. In 1930, Fromm joined the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. It was gathering a remarkable group of thinkers. Theodor Adorno was there, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin in the orbit. These were people trying to understand why human beings, when given the chance to be free, so often chose not to be. Why freedom produced anxiety, not relief. Why people ran back toward the certainties of authority, even bad authority, even authority that would eventually destroy them. It was the question beneath all of Fromm's questions, and it began, underneath everything, with love. Feel the weight of the bed beneath you. Notice where the pillow meets the back of your skull. You do not need to move. If love is an art, and this was Fromm's premise from the opening pages of the book he would publish in 1956, then it follows that mastering it requires the same effort, the same patient return, the same willingness to fail and try again that any other art requires. A painter does not sit down one afternoon and produce something true. They paint badly first. They paint through confusion. They paint through the ugly phase, which can last for years. We do not expect a pianist to play Chopin the first week they touch a keyboard. We do not expect a cabinet maker to build a watertight drawer on the first attempt. We understand, without needing it explained, that any skill worth having requires the long, uncomfortable, often unglamorous process of learning. Why then do we assume that love requires no such process? Fromm had a clear answer, We assume it because we have been taught to think about love in the wrong direction. Every story, every song, every film, every novel we have absorbed since childhood points outward toward the finding of someone, toward the arrival of the feeling, toward the object of love rather than the capacity to love. We have been educated thoroughly and without interruption in the belief that love is something that happens to us, something that arrives or doesn't, something we either have or lack. This is the misunderstanding from which almost all the others follow. The practice is not in finding, the practice is in the daily returning, in the building of the interior. In the long, ordinary, unremarkable work of developing a capacity that the movies never show because it is too quiet to be dramatic. In his Frankfurt study, in the years before the Institute was forced to close, before the Nazis made Germany uninhabitable for everyone in that room, Fromm was working out the architecture of this idea. He was not yet certain how to say it. He was still asking the question. The question is also here. In the dark, with you, let your breath be quiet. The shoulders can drop a little further than they are. Chapter 3. The First Error. Fromm begins The Art of Loving by naming two ways that people misunderstand the problem. The first is to believe that love is primarily a matter of being loved. The question most people carry is not, how do I love? But rather, how do I become someone who will be loved? How do I make myself attractive enough, accomplished enough, interesting enough, agreeable enough that love will come to me? This is a reasonable seeming concern. It is also, in Fromm's view, pointed in exactly the wrong direction. The second misunderstanding is closely related. It is the belief that the problem of love is primarily a problem of the object, finding the right person, the right relationship, the right configuration of lives, as if love were a lock and the question were only to locate the correct key. Both misunderstandings share a common structure. They place the solution outside you. They make love something to be received rather than something to be learned and then given. And they guarantee a certain kind of disappointment because the solution, when placed outside, can always be removed by circumstances. The person can leave, the feeling can change, the configuration can fall apart. What cannot be removed is the capacity. Let your hands rest wherever they are. Let the breath move without help. There is a third error that Fromm identifies, quieter than the first two, and perhaps more damaging for that reason. It is the confusion between falling in love and being in love. Falling in love is involuntary. It is the sudden collapse of the boundary between two people who were strangers. It is one of the most intense experiences available to a human nervous system. The problem is that it is, by its nature, temporary. The boundary, having collapsed, does not stay collapsed. It reconstructs itself, and when it does, what remains is no longer the electricity of the fall, but only the fact of two people who have built a life together and must now decide, in the absence of the electricity, whether to keep building this is when the practice becomes necessary. This is exactly when most people discover they were never taught it. Fromm was not a pessimist about human nature. He did not think that love was rare or that most people were constitutionally incapable of it. He thought the opposite. He thought the capacity was present in nearly everyone. What was missing was the understanding that it was a capacity, something that could be developed, something that required active attention and regular return, not something that either sparkled between two people or didn't. The distinction is precise, and it matters. A spark is either there or it isn't. A skill can always be improved. He would spend the rest of his professional life trying to describe what the improvement required. The first thing it required, and he was clear about this, was the recognition that you were, in fact, practicing something, that your relationships were not simply happening to you, that the patterns were yours. Not in the sense of blame, in the sense of agency, in the sense that patterns, once seen, can be changed. This is where the discomfort lives. Most people in Fromm's consulting room in New York or Mexico City did not want to hear this. They had come to describe what had happened to them. The person who had failed them, or left, or never arrived. To be told that the question ran in both directions, that what they were bringing to love was as relevant as what love had brought them, required a kind of courage that not everyone managed in the first conversation. Most managed it eventually. In his experience, the willingness to look arrived when the pain of not looking became large enough. The body already knows what looking requires. It knows the difference between holding and releasing. Let the jaw soften a little. That is the direction. There is one more thing Fromm said about the first error, the confusion of falling in love with being in love, that is worth holding before we move on. He said that the confusion is not the fault of the people who are confused, it is the fault of the education they received. The culture that surrounds a child growing up in the modern West tells that child through every available channel that the feeling of falling is what love is, that the intensity of early romantic experience is love at its fullest, and that what follows, the ordinary accommodation, the shared responsibility, the accumulated patience of daily life with another person, is love fading rather than love arriving. This education is so thorough and so early and so consistent that most people absorb it before they have any experience against which to measure it. They arrive at their first significant relationships already carrying a template for what love should feel like. And when their actual experience diverges from the template, as it inevitably must, they conclude that they are in the wrong relationship rather than operating from the wrong template. Fromm wanted to offer a different template, not to eliminate the experience of falling, which was real and valuable in its own right, but to locate it correctly in the longer arc of what love actually was. Chapter 4. Frankfurt, 1934. The winter of 1933 was the last winter the Frankfurt Institute would spend in Frankfurt. Hitler had been appointed Chancellor in January. By April, the Institute's bank accounts had been seized. The books its members had written were among the first to be burned in the public squares. By the end of the year, the institute had relocated to Geneva, within another year to New York. Fromm left Germany in 1934. He was 33 years old. He spoke English well enough to teach. He had his training as an analyst and a social philosopher. He had the notes for the book he had not yet written. He had nothing else. He settled in New York, in an apartment in the mid-30s, and began to build a life from scratch. He took analytic patients. He lectured at the New School for Social Research, where many of the Frankfurt emigrants had gathered. He began the long intellectual project that would produce, over the following decades, a series of books. Escape from Freedom in 1941, Man for Himself in 1947, The Sane Society in 1955, and then the small, strange, unexpectedly enduring Art of Loving in 1956. Let your shoulders drop. You do not need to hold them up. Escape from Freedom is the book that established Fromm's reputation. Its central argument is this: freedom is not simply desirable. Freedom is terrifying. The experience of being free, of being responsible for your own choices, your own direction, your own meaning, produces in most people a profound and poorly named anxiety. And when that anxiety becomes unbearable, people reach for escape. The forms of escape are various. Authoritarianism, the surrender of the self to a powerful other who will decide, who will direct, who will take the weight of freedom away. Conformity, the dissolution of the individual self into the group so that there is no longer a self that must choose. Destructiveness, the turning of the anxiety outward into aggression, as a way of feeling something other than the vertigo of being free. He was writing about Germany in the 1930s. He was also writing about something permanent in human psychology. He was not making a political argument exactly, or not only a political argument, he was making a psychological one. The same anxiety that drives people toward political authoritarianism, the anxiety of freedom, the vertigo of being responsible for one's own choices, drives people in their intimate lives toward the same kind of surrender, toward relationships in which someone else decides, someone else carries the weight of direction, someone else provides the structure that makes the experience of freedom bearable. This is why, he argued, so many people confuse the relief of symbiotic union with love. The fusion, the temporary experience of not being alone in one's separateness, provides a relief that genuine love cannot provide, because genuine love does not ask you to stop being yourself. Genuine love requires you to remain yourself. And remaining yourself, when the anxiety of freedom has not yet been resolved, is the harder thing. The connection to love is this. Fromm believed that the same impulse that drives people toward authoritarian escape drives people toward what he called symbiotic union, a form of closeness in which two people fuse together in a way that eliminates the separateness of each. It feels like love because it reduces the loneliness of being a distinct self. But it is not love. It is the avoidance of the very separateness that makes love possible. Real love, in his understanding, requires two whole people, not two halves that complete each other in the sense of filling each other's emptiness, but two complete presences who choose from their completeness to be with each other. The difference between those two structures, symbiotic need versus genuine love, is the difference between clinging and returning, between a grip and a choosing. Fromm spent years watching the difference in his consulting room. He watched people who believed they were deeply in love discover, under careful attention, that what they were actually doing was managing their fear of solitude. And he watched people who had done the harder work, who had learned to be with themselves, to tolerate the room of their own company, arrive at a different kind of relationship, quieter perhaps, less urgent, but grounded in something that did not collapse when the urgency faded. Frankfurt was a long time ago. The tram outside his window, the lamp, the notes he was making by hand, all of it was decades ago. But the pattern he was describing is here, in the room with you now. Notice your breath. Let it continue on its own. Chapter 5. What Freedom Costs. Fromm made a distinction that is worth sitting with slowly. He distinguished between immature love and mature love. Not as a judgment on people who love immaturely. Almost everyone begins there, and many people stay there for understandable reasons, but as a description of two entirely different structures of relating. Immature love says, "I love you because I need you." Mature love says, "I need you because I love you." Read those two sentences again. They are almost identical in their surface arrangement, but they describe opposite relationships between love and need. In the first, love is produced by a deficiency. You are empty, and the other person fills the emptiness. Love is a response to that filling. In the second, love is prior. It is the state from which the need flows. You love, and out of that love, you want the person's presence. The first form depends on the other person for its existence, the second does not. The first collapses when the filling stops. The second survives the ordinary silences and failures of any long relationship because it is not organized around what the other person provides. This is a difficult thing to hear in the dark, without argument. It sits differently at midnight than it would in a lecture hall. Let your body be heavy where it rests. The blanket, the pillow, the surface that holds you. Fromm was not saying that need is shameful. He understood that human beings are social animals, that loneliness is a genuine pain, that the desire to be with another person is one of the most fundamental drives in a human life. He was not telling anyone to stop needing. He was saying that need, when placed at the center of love, makes love into something fragile, something that can only last as long as the other person continues to provide what the need requires. And most people eventually stop providing. Not because they are selfish or unkind, because they are human, because their own needs shift, because life interrupts, because the relationship that began in electricity and novelty settles, as all relationships do, into something more ordinary. And the ordinary, in Fromm's view, is exactly where love is either built or lost. The question of what makes someone capable of mature love, what the internal conditions are for it, occupied Fromm for most of his career. He returned to it from different angles in almost every book. The answer he arrived at, gradually and with great care, was this: the capacity for mature love depends on the prior development of the capacity to be alone. Not isolation, not the kind of alone that is merely the absence of people and nothing else, but solitude, the ability to be in one's own company without anxiety, without the need to immediately fill the space, without the constant reaching outward for stimulation or reassurance. A person who cannot tolerate solitude will seek company not as an expression of love, but as an escape from themselves. And the relationship they build will carry that escape at its center. It will be held together not by genuine affinity, but by mutual need for relief. And here is the small detail that changes everything. Fromm believed that solitude was not something to be endured. He believed it was something to be built, actively. The way a room is built, one wall at a time, with attention and intention. The interior that can be inhabited alone is the same interior that makes genuine love possible. They are not two different projects. They are one. In 1536, a French soldier turned philosopher named Michel de Montaigne, who had lost his closest friend, his father, and several children in the space of a few years, retreated to a round tower room in his chateau near Bordeaux and wrote this: "The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself." Fromm would have recognized the project. He might have said it differently, but he would have recognized it. Let your breath be quiet. There is no place to be tonight except here. Chapter 6. The woman who collected people. He saw many people in his consulting room. Over 40 years of practice, first in New York and later in Cuernavaca, Mexico, where he moved in the 1950s with his third wife, Annis Freeman. 40 years of careful listening in the Tuesday afternoon and the Thursday morning, the soft light through the window and the long silences that held more than the words around them. One patient, he wrote about her in oblique terms, without identifying details, was a woman in her mid-40s who was loved by a great many people. This was not in question. Her social calendar was full. Her phone rang constantly. She gave parties that people looked forward to for weeks. She was described by everyone who knew her as warm and generous and attentive in the particular way of people who make you feel, when you are with them, that you are the only person in the room. She had come to him because she could not sleep. It took several months of careful work before Fromm could name what he was observing. What he saw was this: she was extraordinarily skilled at attending to other people. She noticed moods, remembered preferences, responded to unspoken needs with an accuracy that seemed almost uncanny. But she had never, in his careful questioning, developed the same quality of attention in her own direction. She did not know what she preferred when no one was watching. She did not know what she thought before she had heard what others thought. The interior room, the back room of the self, the place where one is simply oneself without an audience, was a room she had never furnished. She collected people because without them she did not exist. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the breath move without effort. Michel de Montaigne wrote in his essay on solitude that we should have our own back shop in our minds, where we can establish our true liberty and our principal retreat and solitude. He called it the arrière-boutique, the back room behind the shop front, the private room kept only for oneself, not shown to customers. He was writing in the 1570s from his tower near Bordeaux. He had retired from public life at 38, after losing his best friend Etienne de la Boétie to plague, his father to illness, several of his children in infancy. He retreated into books and into his own company, and out of that retreat made something he had not expected, a form of writing that felt, for the first time in the European tradition, like a person simply talking to themselves on the page. The back room he described is what Fromm meant by the interior, the place where one is simply oneself, without performance, without audience, without the management of how one appears. It is not a comfortable place at first. Most people, when they first enter it, find it small and poorly furnished, unfamiliar. The silence is louder there than they expected. But Fromm believed, and 40 years of consulting rooms had given him reason to believe it, that the capacity to sit in that room quietly and without panic was the precondition for everything else. For the genuine meeting of two people, for the ability to give attention rather than extract it, for love as an act rather than love as a need. The woman who collected people was not incapable of love. Fromm was clear about this. She was capable of extraordinary warmth. What she had not yet developed was the groundedness in herself from which love can be given freely, without the giving becoming the only evidence that she existed. It took a long time to build the back room. It always does. But it can be built. The room you are in now, in the dark, it is a form of that back room. Nothing is required of you. You are simply here. Chapter 7. Need and Love. In the first pages of The Art of Loving, Fromm describes an experiment that a reader can perform on themselves. Think about the people you have loved in your life. Not all of them, just the most significant ones. The ones whose absence made the room different. Now ask, without judgment, what exactly were you giving them? And what were you receiving? Most people, when they first sit with this question, discover that the balance is harder to name than they expected, that the line between giving and receiving is less clear than it appeared, that some of what they described as love was in practice a sophisticated form of management, the management of another person's state in order to regulate their own. This is not a condemnation, it is an observation. Fromm was not interested in making people feel worse about themselves. He was interested in precision, because imprecision in this territory causes a great deal of unnecessary suffering. The body knows the difference if you are quiet enough to listen. Let your breath slow. Notice what you feel when you think of being genuinely seen by someone, not evaluated, not managed, but simply seen. There is a quality of rest in that, a settling that is different from relief. Fromm distinguished between two developmental stages in the experience of love. In the earliest stage of life, love is entirely received. The infant loves its mother, or rather, the infant experiences something that will later be called love, not as a free act, but as a response to being held and fed and cared for. It is love organized around receiving. This is appropriate for an infant. It is the only kind of love an infant can manage. The problem is that many people, for reasons that are almost always understandable, never fully move past it. The second stage is the shift from the logic of receiving to the logic of giving. In this stage, love is no longer primarily about what you get from the other person. It is about what you bring to them. And the remarkable thing, the thing that Fromm found again and again in his consulting room, is that giving love, when it is genuine and not compulsive, produces something that receiving love alone cannot. A sense of aliveness, of being, as he put it, the one who loves. This distinction, the one who loves versus the one who is loved, is not about hierarchy, it is about orientation, and the orientation of the mature lover is outward, toward the actual existence of another person, their needs, their growth, their particular way of being in the world. Carl Rogers, who was building his own theory of human relationships in the same decades that Fromm was working, would have called this unconditional positive regard. The quality of seeing another person without the constant filter of your own needs, without the silent question that so many relationships organize themselves around, what does this person's existence do for me? Rogers put it this way in On Becoming a Person: the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. He was describing the therapeutic relationship. But Fromm would have recognized the same paradox in every genuine act of love. The lover who stops trying to change the beloved into what they need them to be, that lover is, for the first time, actually seeing them. And being seen, in Rogers' view and in Fromm's, is one of the most restorative experiences available to a human being. Let your jaw soften. Let the eyes, behind the lids, release whatever they are holding. There is a specific quality to the love that is organized around giving that Fromm thought was often mistaken for something it was not. People who love in the giving mode are sometimes seen as selfless, as self-sacrificing, as organized entirely around the other person at the expense of themselves. Fromm did not think this was accurate. He thought that genuine giving that came from a full interior rather than from a compulsion to manage the other person or to earn their approval, was not a sacrifice of the self, it was an expression of it. The person who gives generously from a full interior is not depleting themselves, they are enacting what they are. The giving is not a cost to them in the way that it is a cost to the person who gives from obligation or from fear of what will happen if they don't. The full giver and the obligated giver both give. Only one of them is practicing love. The shift from receiving to giving is not a moral achievement. It is a developmental one. And, like all development, it happens slowly, with setbacks, in no particular hurry. Chapter 8. What Fromm learned in the consulting room. He listened for 40 years. This is not a metaphor. Fromm maintained an active clinical practice for the whole of his working life. He saw patients in New York from the late 1930s until the early 1950s, when he moved to Cuernavaca, Mexico, and continued seeing people there until late into his career. The books were important to him, but the books, in his own description, grew out of the listening. The theories were always tested against the actual person sitting across from him in the room. What he heard across those 40 years was a theme so consistent that it eventually lost the quality of surprise. Nearly everyone who came to him with a problem they described as a love problem was, in fact, carrying a confusion about what love required of them. Not a character flaw, not a deficit of feeling, a confusion about the direction of the work. They had been looking outward when the question faced inward. Let your body be heavy. Notice where you feel the weight. The heels, the hips, the shoulders. Simone Weil, the French philosopher who left her teaching post in 1934 to work on the floor of the Renault factory in Paris because she refused to write about labor she had not carried, wrote in a letter to her friend Joe Bousquet in 1942, that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Fromm would not have disagreed. He would perhaps have added, and the most teachable. What Fromm observed in his consulting room was that the people who arrived in his office, having genuinely developed the capacity to love, shared certain qualities. They were, in his description, people who had developed the discipline of attention. Not the performance of attention, not the active listening posture of someone who has been told to make eye contact and reflect back what they hear, but the real thing. The willingness to let another person's actual existence register, rather than the version of them that confirms what you already believe or need. This is harder than it sounds. It requires, among other things, a prior quieting of the self, a temporary suspension of the running internal commentary, the needs, the judgments, the plans, the fears that normally fills the foreground of consciousness while another person speaks. Weil called this, in Gravity and Grace, the highest degree of attention. She wrote, in her particular way, that attention taken to its absolute limit is prayer. She was not using the word sentimentally. She meant something structural, the total placement of the mind on something outside itself, the temporary dissolution of the self's own concerns into full presence with what is real. Fromm did not use that language, but he was describing the same movement. In his consulting room, he noticed that when he was able to give this quality of attention to a patient, when he was fully present with what they were actually saying, rather than with what he expected them to say, or what category their material fit, or what intervention he planned to offer, something changed in the room. The patient noticed it, often without being able to name what had changed. There was a settling, a quality of being received that went beyond the content of the exchange. He thought this was what love felt like from the inside, not the sensation, the structural experience of being fully attended to by someone who has temporarily set down their own agenda. The question then was how to cultivate that quality of attention. How to develop it so that it was not an occasional accident of a good hour, but something available, something practiced, something that could be offered in the ordinary texture of a day. He had an answer. It was uncomfortable in its ordinariness. The answer was discipline. The long, daily, unglamorous practice of returning the attention to what is real, returning it when it drifts, returning it without drama. The way a breath returns over and over, in the simple fact of being alive, he was aware that this answer would disappoint people looking for something more dramatic. He was aware that the contemporary culture, even in 1956, was organized around a preference for techniques over practices, for shortcuts over the long accumulation, for the promise that the result could be achieved without the process that the result required. He offered it anyway, because it was what he had seen in 40 years of listening actually work. Not work in the sense of producing a perfect love, or a flawless relationship, or the complete resolution of the separateness that underlies all human experience. Work in the sense of producing something genuine. The small, durable, genuinely felt contact between two people who had built, over time, the capacity to see each other honestly. This was enough. In his experience, this was more than most people had managed, and it was available to anyone willing to engage the practice. Chapter 9. The Two Questions. First, seed. There are two questions at the center of Fromm's work that he kept circling decade after decade in different formulations. He returned to them in the consulting room, in the lecture hall, in his notebooks and journals, in the margins of books he was reading. The first, do I practice love or do I wait for it? The second, do I attend or do I merely occupy? We are not going to answer them now. That is not why they are here. They are here to sit at the edge of your attention as the night deepens. Not demanding resolution, not accusing, simply present the way a question is present when it has been given room to be itself. We will come back to them. We are getting closer as the hours go on to what Fromm meant by each. Let the questions rest. What Fromm meant by practice was not a technique. He was precise about this because he thought the confusion of practice with technique was one of the principal errors of the therapeutic culture that had grown up around psychoanalysis. A technique is something applied from the outside. Practice is something cultivated from the inside. A technique can be performed. Practice must be inhabited. He was also clear that practice did not mean effort in the sense of strain. A violinist who practices correctly is not muscling through the scales. They are training their hands and their listening until the correct movement becomes available, becomes natural, becomes part of what playing is, rather than what playing requires them to remember to do. The effort is in the early years of training. What the effort builds over time is ease. Fromm believed that love worked the same way. The early effort of learning, the discipline of attention, the practice of solitude, the willingness to sit with difficult feelings rather than escape them, was the work of building the capacity. The capacity, once built, did not require constant effort. It became available. It became what one brought to a relationship naturally, rather than what one had to remind oneself to bring. He had seen people arrive at this. Not many, in the statistical sense, but not rare either. In his experience, the people who had built this capacity were not exceptional in any dramatic way. They were not enlightened, or spiritual, or philosophically sophisticated. They were, in almost all cases, people who had undergone a significant difficulty, a loss, a failure, a long period of solitude they had not chosen, and had used that difficulty as the occasion for the internal work rather than the occasion for a new escape. The difficulty, in other words, was not the obstacle. The difficulty was the teacher. Let your body be heavy. Let your mind go where it goes. Nothing is required. What Fromm meant by attending, as distinct from merely occupying the same space as another person, we will approach gradually. It requires a detour through some territory that may feel counterintuitive, namely, the practice of attending fully to oneself first. This was, in his understanding, the necessary precondition. You cannot genuinely attend to another person's existence if you have not yet learned to attend to your own. The two questions are still here. Do I practice, or do I wait? Do I attend, or do I merely occupy? They will keep. The night has a long way to go. There is a related question that Fromm did not always make explicit, but that lives beneath the other two. It is the question of what we are afraid of finding when we look honestly. The waiting is not only habit, the non-attending is not only distraction. They are also, in many cases, protective. The person who genuinely asks whether they are practicing may discover that the answer is no, and has been no for longer than they can comfortably acknowledge. The person who genuinely attends to another person's existence may discover that what they have been seeing has been filtered through their own needs in ways they had not recognized. These discoveries are available. They are not comfortable. They are the entry point into the practice that Fromm was describing. The night has time for them. Chapter 10, The Back Room of the Self. Montaigne retired from public life in November of 1571 at the age of 38. He had served in the Parliament of Bordeaux. He had been present at the court of Charles IX. He had been, for a period in his mid-30s, secretary to Henri II. He had, by the standards of his age, a career. He walked away from it. He went to his chateau, to the round tower at its corner, to a room with books on 3 walls and 1 window looking out over the Dordogne. He had the ceiling beams inscribed with Greek and Latin sentences that seemed to him worth having in the room. And he began to write. He called what he was doing essays, attempts, from the French essayer, to try. The form he invented was unprecedented. He was not writing about philosophy. He was not writing about history or theology or the properties of the natural world. He was writing about himself, about what it was like to be Michel de Montaigne, with his particular memories and his particular fears and his particular inability to remember names and his particular way of sitting too long in his chair. He did this not because he thought he was unusually interesting, but because he thought that a careful examination of any particular human life would reveal things about human life in general that no amount of abstraction could locate. He was right. Let the breath slow. Notice the feeling of the sheets, or the covers, or whatever surface is touching your skin. What Montaigne was building in his tower was exactly what Fromm would later call the interior, the back room, the place behind the shop front where one is simply oneself without transaction. In his essay on solitude, written around 1580, Montaigne says this: "We must reserve a back shop all our own, entirely free, in which to establish our real liberty and our principal retreat and solitude. Here, our ordinary conversation must be between us and ourselves." He was 50 years old when he published these words. He had spent years building the room before he could describe it. End wrong. Reading Montaigne in his Cuernavaca study in the early 1950s, his Spanish was excellent by then. He had become genuinely Mexican. In his sensibility, would have recognized the project. The interior is not built through introspection alone. It is built through the combination of solitude and honest examination. Through the willingness to sit in one's own company long enough that the posturing subsides and what remains is simply the truth of what is there. Most people, Fromm observed, spend their lives managing the distance from this truth, not because they are dishonest, but because the truth, when finally encountered, is often more complicated than the version they have been presenting to others and to themselves. There is, underneath the competent surface, confusion. There is, beneath the assured voice, fear. There is, in the well-organized life, a question that has never been asked because there has never been a quiet hour in which to ask it. The back room is where the question lives, and the question is not comfortable. But Fromm believed, Montaigne believed before him, that inhabiting it was the condition for everything else. For the genuine life, for the genuine meeting of two people, each of whom has done the work of becoming someone who can be in the room with themselves. The room you are in now is quiet. Let it be quiet. There is no performance required here. Chapter 11. What practice means. Fromm identified 3 elements that the art of loving requires. He called them discipline, concentration, and patience. He was careful to say that none of these words meant what most people in the 20th century assumed they meant. The modern understanding of discipline is essentially punitive. It involves forcing yourself to do something you do not want to do through willpower against resistance. The modern understanding of concentration is primarily instrumental. It is the ability to focus on a task in order to complete it more efficiently. And patience, in everyday usage, has been reduced to mere waiting. Fromm meant something different by each. Discipline, in his understanding, was not the imposition of will over resistance. It was the cultivation of a practice so regular and so integrated into daily life that it no longer felt like imposition at all. A pianist who has practiced for years does not discipline themselves to play scales each morning. Playing scales is simply part of what they are. The discipline, having been applied over time, has become structure. The structure, having become structure, has become available. He thought that people in modern life were desperately under-disciplined in this sense, not because they lacked willpower, but because they had been given no map of what to practice. They worked hard, they exercised, they managed their careers with considerable attention. But the interior life, the cultivation of the capacity for love, for genuine attention, for solitude without anxiety, had no recognized place in the curriculum of a well-lived life. He thought this was a peculiarity of the modern West, and he was worried about it. Let your body sink a little further. Feel the surface beneath you. It is doing the holding. You can let it. Concentration, in Fromm's usage, meant something closer to what Simone Weil meant by attention. The ability to be fully present with what is in front of you, a person, a problem, an experience, without the simultaneous management of everything else that normally crowds the foreground of the mind. Not multitasking, not processing, simply being with what is there. He thought this quality was nearly extinct in modern life. And he was writing in 1956, before the internet, before the smartphone, before the permanent availability of stimulation that now makes the unoccupied moment feel like a small emergency. He was worried about what television and radio and the general acceleration of modern life were doing to the capacity for sustained attention. He would not have believed the world that followed. Patience, in his view, was not the passive endurance of delay. It was the active refusal to rush, the willingness to let development proceed at its own pace without forcing it, the understanding that some things take the time they take, and that the forcing of them, the attempt to arrive at the result without passing through the process, produces a result that looks like the real thing but is not. A forced relationship, a forced intimacy, a forced understanding of another person, constructed in advance of actually listening. He had seen all of these in his consulting room. They shared a common quality. They were organized around the need for the result rather than the discipline of the process. And they produced in almost every case the same outcome. The result did not last because the process that would have made it real had never been engaged. William James, the American psychologist who climbed out of his own depression by making the deliberate choice to believe in free will, writing in his diary on the 30th of April 1870 that his first act of free will shall be to believe in free will, spent years studying the psychology of habit. He concluded that habit was the great flywheel of society, that the daily repeated unchosen movements of a life accumulate into character, that you become, eventually, whatever you regularly practice. Fromm would have agreed. Love is what you practice, not what you feel, not what you wait for, not what you find, what you practice. The night is long. Let it be long. The relationship between discipline and ease was something Fromm returned to repeatedly because he knew it ran against cultural grain. The culture of his era and of every era since was organized around shortcuts, the technique that produces the result without the process, the 5-step method for achieving what the long years of practice would have built. He was not contemptuous of these offerings. He understood why they were sought, but he was honest about what they could not provide. They could not provide the genuine capacity. They could provide the performance of the capacity, and the performance, however convincing, was not the thing itself. The thing itself, the quiet, available, practiced ability to be present with another person's existence, was not acquirable in 5 steps or 50. It was built day after day through the unremarkable discipline of return. The long night is itself a version of that practice. Chapter 12. The discipline that is not punishment. Karen Horney was born in Germany in 1885, the daughter of a Norwegian sea captain and a Dutch mother. She trained as a physician and then as a psychoanalyst in Berlin, studying with Carl Abraham, one of Freud's closest colleagues. She was, for the first years of her career, a devoted Freudian. And then, slowly, she began to disagree. Her most important contribution was a concept she called the tyranny of the should. She observed that many of the patients she worked with were not suffering primarily from unconscious conflicts in the Freudian sense. They were suffering from a gap between who they believed they should be and who they actually were. The idealized self, the version of themselves they carried as an internal standard, was so demanding, so perfectionist, so relentlessly critical of any deviation from its requirements that the actual self could never quite measure up. The result was not motivation. The result was paralysis, depression, and a pervasive sense of not being enough. Horney called this the tyranny of the should because the should was not chosen. It had been installed largely in childhood by the expectations and evaluations of others. And it operated not as a guide, but as a prosecutor, a constant internalized voice that measured every action against an impossible standard and found it wanting. Let your hands rest. They do not need to do anything right now. Fromm was aware of Horney's work. They had been contemporaries in New York, part of the same wave of German Jewish intellectuals who had rebuilt their lives in the city after 1933. He recognized in her formulation something he had observed in his own work, that the most significant obstacle to the discipline of love was not laziness or incapacity, but a mistaken model of what discipline required. Most people, when they try to discipline themselves toward a better way of loving, do it through the mechanism of the should. They tell themselves they should be more patient, more attentive, more giving, less defensive, less needy. They generate a list of corrections and apply it to themselves with the same prosecutorial energy that Horney's patients applied to their entire lives. And it does not work. Not because the corrections are wrong, but because the mechanism is wrong. The should produces not capacity, but anxiety. Not change, but the performance of change, maintained just long enough to be interrupted by the next crisis. Carl Rogers, who had arrived at his own understanding of change from the other direction, from years of observing what actually shifted in the people he worked with, put it this way in On Becoming a Person, published in 1961. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. This sounds paradoxical. It is not. The paradox dissolves when you understand that acceptance and complacency are not the same thing. Acceptance is the honest acknowledgement of what is actually present. Complacency is the decision that what is present is fine and requires no attention. Rogers was not recommending complacency. He was saying that change requires as its first condition a clear and uncritical view of the thing that needs to change. You cannot change what you are defending. You cannot improve what you cannot see. The wall of the should is also a wall against seeing. Fromm would say, the discipline that serves love is not the discipline of the should. It is the discipline of the return. The daily, unremarkable returning of attention to what is real in yourself, in the other person, in the space between you. No prosecution, no performance. Just the honest, repeated looking. Let your breath slow. Nothing is being demanded of you right now. Let the night hold what it holds. There is something worth naming about the difference between the discipline of the should and the discipline of return, because the line between them is not always visible from the inside. The discipline of the should announces itself with pressure. There is an edge of urgency to it, a background tone of not yet enough. It produces a self that is always performing the correction, always monitoring the gap between where it is and where it should be. The discipline of return is quieter. It does not announce itself at all, usually. It simply arrives in the choice to look up, in the choice to ask the real question, in the choice to be present rather than to manage the appearance of presence. And when it fails, when the attention drifts, when the day's tiredness wins, when the connection is missed, the return does not add a charge to the ledger, it simply returns, without drama, without prosecution. This is what Fromm meant by a practice rather than a performance. The practice does not require perfection. It only requires the willingness to keep returning. Chapter 13, To Have or to Be. In 1976, Fromm published what would be his last major work. He was 75 years old. He had been in psychoanalytic practice for nearly 5 decades. He had written 12 books. His daughter Regina later said that he was still seeing patients until a few years before his death. The book was called To Have or to Be. It is in many ways the culmination of everything he had been thinking since Frankfurt. It makes one distinction and then follows that distinction to its end. The distinction is between 2 modes of existence. The having mode is organized around possession, around the accumulation of objects, relationships, experiences, identities, titles, memories. In the having mode, the question you ask of everything is this mine? Can I keep it? Does its existence add to what I have? The being mode is organized differently. In the being mode, the question is not what you possess, but what you are doing, what you are experiencing, what you are actively engaging with. The being mode does not try to fix, to freeze, to own. It participates. It moves through. Fromm was not saying that the having mode is evil and the being mode is good. He was saying that the having mode, when it becomes the dominant orientation of a life, when it colonizes the areas that require the being mode to thrive, produces a particular kind of suffering that is very hard to diagnose, because everything looks fine from the outside. Let the breath move slowly. Notice it moving. You do not need to change it. He was especially interested in what happens to love when it is organized around the having mode. Love in the having mode treats the other person as an object. Not in a cynical or predatory sense, usually not consciously and usually not maliciously, but structurally. The relationship becomes something possessed, maintained, protected against loss. The question that organizes it is, does this person still belong to me? Are they still providing what I need them to provide? When the answer to those questions is uncertain, when the other person behaves unexpectedly or pulls away, or simply changes in the way that all people change over time, the response of the having mode is anxiety, control, or withdrawal. Because a possession that cannot be controlled is not really a possession. Love in the being mode is organized entirely differently. The question is not whether the other person belongs to you, but whether you are genuinely present with them, whether your attention is real, whether your interest is in their actual existence, their growth, their struggles, their particular way of moving through the world, rather than their fulfillment of a role in your own story. Fromm called this the active character of love. Love is not a state, it is an activity, a verb, not a noun, something you do continuously through choices so small that they rarely feel like choices at all. The decision to look up from the book when the other person enters the room, the decision to ask the question that is actually relevant rather than the one you already know the answer to, the decision to be interested, genuinely interested in what the other person is thinking, when interest does not produce anything you need. These small decisions, accumulated over years, are what love builds from. Or they are what it fails to build from. The distinction is not dramatic. The dramatic moments in a relationship, the arguments, the crises, the declarations, are rarely where love is won or lost. It is won or lost in the ordinary texture of an ordinary day. At the breakfast table, in the car, in the 10 minutes before sleep, in the 10 minutes before sleep. Here, now. Fromm observed that the having mode and the being mode were not equally available in all hours. The having mode was the default. It ran automatically, required no cultivation, was reinforced by almost every structure of the world he was writing in and the world that followed. The being mode required something. It required, at minimum, the decision to stop the accumulation long enough to ask what was actually present. This was not a philosophical decision, it was a practical one. The practical question was, in this moment, am I trying to add to what I have, or am I simply here with what is? In the 10 minutes before sleep, when the day is over and nothing can be added to or protected or managed anymore, in those minutes the being mode is more available than at almost any other time. The body is already in it. The breath is already practicing it. What remains is simply the willingness of the mind to follow. Chapter 14. What you accumulate at 2 a.m. It is after midnight, or it is not far from it. This is the hour when the mind begins its accounting. Not the pleasant kind of accounting, the other kind. The inventory of what was left undone, what was said badly, what was taken for granted that perhaps should not have been. The mental ledger that the having mode keeps automatically without being asked, tracking losses, tallying what has been gained and what has been spent and what can still be recovered. Most people do not choose to do this. It happens to them. The body quiets, the stimulation of the day falls away, and what remains is the running background calculation that was there all along, just too quiet to hear over the noise. Fromm would have recognized the 2 a.m. accountant. He had heard the reports of its activities from many people in his consulting room. He was not contemptuous of it. He understood that the accounting mind is trying to do something useful, to manage uncertainty, to identify risks, to ensure that nothing important is missed. The problem is that at 2 a.m., with the body horizontal and the defenses down, it is very bad at distinguishing between what is urgent and what is merely anxious. Let your body be heavy. Feel the weight of the mattress or the cushion beneath you. Nothing in this room requires your management. The having mode, when it runs at full power in the dark hours, produces a specific texture of suffering. It is not the sharp pain of acute loss. It is the grinding, low-grade, exhausting quality of never quite having enough, never quite being secure enough, never quite having said the right thing, made the right choice, accumulated enough evidence of one's own worth to rest. Fromm called this one of the deepest ironies of the having mode. The more you accumulate, achievements, relationships, experiences, reassurances, the more there is to lose. And the more there is to lose, the more the accounting mind works to protect what has been accumulated. It is, in his phrase, a machine that produces its own anxiety. The being mode does not do this. In the being mode, the question is not what you have accumulated, but what you are currently in contact with. The experience of love in this mode is not diminished by the fear of its loss. It is simply what is happening, the actual texture of two people in the same room, breathing the same air, their silence having the particular quality that it has in this moment and no other. This is not mysticism. It is a description of a different organization of attention. The accountant who wakes at 2 a.m. and begins calculating is not wrong to want security. It is not wrong to want love to be stable. The question is whether security comes from counting what you have or from trusting what you are. Fromm's answer, accumulated over 4 decades of listening, was unequivocal. Security in love does not come from possession. It comes from the quality of presence you bring to it day after day in the small and ordinary acts of genuine attention. The accountant can rest. The books will still be there in the morning. They will look different in the morning. Let your eyes close fully if they have not already. Let the numbers fade. Fromm thought there was something worth understanding about the specific hour of 2 a.m. the hour at which the accounting mind most reliably arrives. Not because anything catastrophic is more likely to happen at 2 a.m. than at noon, but because at 2 a.m. the mechanisms that normally regulate the accounting are offline. The distractions are gone. The company is gone. The stimulation and the noise and the forward motion of the day, all of it has stopped. What remains when everything has stopped is the baseline, the condition of the self when no one is watching and nothing is required and the performance has been suspended. For many people, this baseline is uncomfortable, not because the self is bad, because the self has never been given a quiet hour in which to become familiar. Because the interior has been left largely unfurnished, and the unfurnished room, encountered in the dark without warning, can feel strange and vast and full of things one cannot quite name. Fromm's counsel in that hour was the same counsel he offered for everything else. Do not flee the room. Stay a little. The strangeness, encountered honestly, is not as large as the flight from it suggests. And the self discovered in that quiet, met with patience rather than prosecution, is almost always more bearable than the avoiding of it. Chapter 15. The Retired Manager. There was a man, Fromm described a version of him in Man for Himself, his 1947 work on ethics and character, who had spent 30 years in middle management at a firm in the industrial Midwest. He had not chosen his career consciously. He had entered the firm at 23, in the years after the war, and moved steadily upward through the levels of the organization. Not because he was especially ambitious, but because he was competent and reliable and good at managing other people. He retired at 63. His wife had died 3 years earlier. His children were in other cities. The firm gave him a watch and a dinner and a card signed by 34 people, most of whose names he could not clearly remember afterward. And then it was Tuesday. Tuesday with no alarm. Tuesday with no meeting at 9 and no report due at 11 and no subordinate waiting outside the door with a problem that required his attention. Tuesday in a house that was very quiet and contained no role for him to inhabit. He did not know who he was without the title. Let your shoulders drop. Nothing is required of you right now. Fromm used this kind of story. He had versions of it from many different patients to illustrate what he saw as one of the central pathologies of modern life: the substitution of role for identity, the construction of a self that is entirely organized around function, what you do, what you produce, what you provide for others, with no interior room built, no private self cultivated, no sense of who one is when the function is removed. The man did not lack feelings. He was not, in any clinical sense, empty. He had opinions, memories, preferences. But these had never been organized into anything he recognized as a self independent of his position. The position had done the organizing, and without it, the parts did not cohere. This is not a failure of character. In Fromm's view, it was an entirely predictable outcome of a culture that values productivity above almost all other human qualities, that defines a person primarily by what they contribute to the economic system rather than by the quality of their inner life. The man had done what the culture asked of him, and done it well. The culture had simply failed to tell him that it was leaving a room unbuilt. William James, who spent years studying what he called the social self, the self that is reflected back from others' perceptions, observed that a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image of him in their mind. Most people, James noted, care enormously about these reflected selves. Their sense of who they are is largely constructed from what others see. This is normal. It is not sufficient. What the retired manager lacked was what Montaigne had built in his tower, the self that continues to exist when no one is looking, the self that can sit in a room on a Tuesday and not require the room to provide purpose. Fromm's point was not that this man had failed to love. His point was that this man had never had the internal foundation that love requires. He had given well within the structures available to him. But the giving had been organized around the role, not around the freely chosen act of an interior self. The back room had never been built, and now he was in it, with no furniture. Building begins whenever it begins. Tuesday is as good a day as any. Chapter 16. The body in the dark room. There are two kinds of tiredness, and you may have been carrying the second one for longer than you know. The first kind is simple. The body has used its resources for the day and needs to recover them. Sleep provides this. 8 hours of sleep most nights, and the first kind of tiredness resolves itself reliably. The second kind does not resolve with sleep. It is the tiredness that is present even on the mornings when you have slept long enough. The tiredness that arrives not in the muscles but behind the eyes, in the quality of attention, in the way the ordinary events of the day require a little more effort than they seem like they should. The tiredness of having been, for a long time, available to everyone and present with no one, including yourself. Fromm would have recognized this tiredness immediately. He had heard about it in many different forms. Sometimes it arrived as the feeling of going through the motions, sometimes as a vague sense that something important was missing without being able to name what, sometimes as the discovery, after achieving something significant, that the achievement did not produce the feeling that was expected. It is the tiredness of the self, asking, quietly and without drama, for permission to stop performing. Let your body be exactly as heavy as it is. Let the breath move without assistance. There is nothing to manage right now. The body knows about this before the mind does, usually. The body begins to signal fatigue in the small ways, the shoulders that tighten at the sound of certain voices, the stomach that clenches at the sound of certain thoughts, the quality of deep tiredness that arrives not at the end of a hard day, but at the beginning of a day that is going to require the maintenance of something, the maintenance of an image, the maintenance of a role, the maintenance of a version of yourself that the world has come to expect and that you have been providing reliably for long enough that you have forgotten when the maintenance began. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The heaviness is the body returning to itself. Let it. Fromm wrote about the concept of alienation. a concept he borrowed from the early Marx, though he developed it in his own direction. Alienation, in Fromm's usage, is the experience of being separated from the products of one's own activity. In the economic realm, the worker who produces goods that belong to someone else experiences this. But Fromm was interested in a subtler form, the person who has produced a self that no longer feels like their own. The self presented at work, and the self presented at home, and the self presented in social situations have been constructed over years with such care and such habit that they have become automatic. And the person who constructed them is tired, not from the content of the roles. The work is fine, the family is fine, the social world is fine, but from the distance between the person who inhabits the roles and the person who exists when the roles are briefly suspended. The body in the dark room is the self with the performance suspended. The heaviness you feel is not failure. It is the relief of having nothing to maintain. This relief is what Fromm wanted his patients to find their way to regularly, not just in sleep, but in waking life, in solitude, in genuine conversation, in the moments of actual contact with another person. The relief of not performing. It is available now. Let it be. Chapter 17. What concentration requires. Of the three elements Fromm identified, discipline, concentration, patience, concentration may be the most endangered in the contemporary world and the most essential. He defined concentration in The Art of Loving as the ability to be alone with oneself. He meant something precise by this. Concentration is not focus in the sense of narrowing attention to a task. It is the ability to experience one's own presence, to be aware of oneself without distraction, without the constant reaching outward for stimulation or confirmation or reassurance. In 1654, Blaise Pascal wrote in the Pensées that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was not being rhetorical. He was describing an observation he had made about himself and about everyone around him. The flight from silence, the constant motion from one diversion to the next, the difficulty of simply being present with the contents of one's own mind. Fromm read Pascal carefully. He agreed. But Fromm also thought that Pascal's formulation missed something. The inability to sit quietly in a room was not simply a moral failure or a philosophical deficiency. It was, in his understanding, a symptom. A symptom of the fact that the room, when one sat in it, was not comfortable. The interior was poorly furnished. The back shop had no warmth, no light, no known arrangement. Of course, people fled it. The question was not how to force yourself to stay in the uncomfortable room, but how to furnish it. Let your eyes be closed. Let the room around you be simply dark and quiet. Nothing in it requires your management. The furnishing happens slowly, through practice, through the regular return to one's own company, not in the spirit of navel-gazing or self-absorption, but in the spirit of genuine inquiry. What is actually here? What do I actually think when I have not yet heard what others think? What do I feel underneath the response I am planning to have? These are not comfortable questions. They do not have neat answers. But the practice of asking them over time produces something that Fromm considered indispensable. The experience of being a subject rather than an object. The experience of having an interior life that is genuinely one's own, that exists independently of its reflection in other people's eyes. This is what makes genuine concentration in the presence of another person possible. You can be with someone fully, without losing yourself in them, only if you have a self to come from. Fromm observed that people who had not developed this interior often described their most intense relationships as experiences of losing themselves. They meant this positively. They felt that in losing themselves, they had finally become real, finally found the completion they had been looking for. What they were actually experiencing, in his analysis, was the temporary relief of having the responsibility for a self transferred to the relationship. The relief was real, but it was borrowed against the future, because the relationship, like all relationships, would eventually demand something of each person individually, would eventually return each person to their own company. And the person who has borrowed their reality from the relationship finds, when the return happens, that the room is still unfurnished. Concentration, the genuine capacity to be present with oneself and with another, requires the long, ordinary work of building the interior. There is no shortcut through it. There is only the daily returning. The room you are in is a form of practice. Let it continue. Pascal had one more observation about the inability to sit quietly in a room that Fromm found useful. He noted that the diversions people sought were not random, they were targeted. They were specifically designed by the person seeking them, often unconsciously, to address the particular quality of discomfort that solitude produced. The discomfort was not formless, it had a shape. It was organized around specific thoughts, specific memories, specific unresolved things that lived in the silence of the unfurnished room and became audible only when everything else had stopped. This was, in Fromm's view, useful information. The discomfort pointed. It pointed toward exactly what needed the patient attention of the practice. The thought that keeps arriving when the phone is put down is not an intruder. It is a communication from the interior that has been waiting for the quiet to say what it needed to say. The practice of sitting quietly in the room is, among other things, the practice of being willing to hear it. Chapter 18, Simone Weil and the Gift of Seeing. In October of 1934, Simone Weil submitted her resignation from the lycée where she had been teaching philosophy. She was 25 years old. She had been, by every external measure, a successful academic philosopher, brilliant, exacting, with a reputation among her students for demanding more careful thought than most professors attempted. She resigned in order to work on the factory floor. She took a position at the Alstom factory in Paris, then at J.J. Carnot, then at the Renault plant in Boulogne-Billancourt. She worked on the assembly line, she operated machinery. She learned what it was to move your hands in the same motion, 8 hours a day, for wages that did not cover the month. She was weak physically, she had always been, and the work was hard in a way that her academic life had never been hard. She got sick. She kept going. She kept a factory journal. She wrote about the way industrial labor produced a specific form of consciousness, fragmented, exhausted, stripped of the kind of sustained attention that she had always thought of as the precondition for human dignity. She also wrote about what she discovered when she managed to maintain it anyway. When she managed, against the conditions of the factory, to bring her full attention to the person in front of her, or to the work itself, or to the thought that was trying to form in the margins of the day. Let your breath be slow. Let your mind go where it goes. Nothing is required of you. In a letter to her friend Joe Bousquet in April 1942, by which time she had left France, had been interned at Gurs, had escaped, and was writing from Marseille on her way to Morocco and eventually London, she wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." This is one of the few things she wrote that can be quoted out of context and still carry its meaning. The sentence is complete in itself. What Weil meant by attention was not the performance of attentiveness. It was not eye contact, or the posture of listening, or the reflection back of what someone has said. It was the total placement of the mind on another person's existence, the willingness to let what is actually true about them register, without the filter of what you need them to be or what you fear they might become. She was writing about a quality she had observed in herself as rare, genuinely rare, not rhetorically rare. She had noticed that most human interactions, even loving ones, even well-intentioned ones, are organized around what each person needs from the other. What she called the gravity of self-interest, the natural pull of every mind toward its own concerns, shapes perception without announcing itself. You see what you need to see. You hear what confirms what you already believe. The other person's actual existence passes through the filter of your own. To see through the filter, to actually receive another person's existence rather than your own reflection in their presence, required in her analysis a kind of suppression of the self. Not a suppression that was cold or indifferent, a suppression that was, paradoxically, the most generous thing one human being could offer another. Fromm had arrived at the same place from a different direction. He called it the active quality of love, the turning of the full self, with all its capacity for attention, toward the actual existence of another person. He had also noticed, as Weil had, that it was rare, that most people, even people in long, committed relationships, rarely experienced this quality of being seen. That its absence was one of the most common sources of the loneliness that brought people to his consulting room. Not loneliness in the sense of being without company, loneliness in the sense of being with people and still not being met. Simone Weil was 34 when she died of tuberculosis in Ashford, England, in August 1943. She had refused to eat more than the ration she believed was available to the people living under German occupation in France. Her attention, in the end, extended to a refusal she knew would cost her. The lamp in Fromm's study was still on. It is still on. Weil's understanding of attention as generosity was connected to a broader argument she made about the relationship between the individual and the world. She believed that the deepest affliction of modern human beings was not poverty or injustice or the failures of political systems, though she took all of those seriously. The deepest affliction was what she called uprooting, the experience of being cut off from the things that give a life its particular texture and meaning. Community, tradition, work that is genuinely one's own. The uprooted person cannot attend to anything beyond themselves because there is nothing stable outside themselves to attend to. Love, in her understanding, was the practice of re-rooting, of placing the attention fully, generously, without the constant filter of one's own needs, on something real outside the self, and allowing that something real to actually register, to matter, to change what you think and what you want and what you are willing to do. This is what she had learned at the Renault factory. Not what labor was like from the outside, what labor was like from the inside of a mind that refused to stop attending, even when attending was the harder thing. Chapter 19, What he said about loneliness. Third seed. There is a word that Fromm used carefully throughout his work, distinguishing it from a word most people treat as its synonym. The word is loneliness. The word it is not synonymous with is solitude. He made this distinction in several of his books, but most precisely in The Art of Loving. Solitude, in his usage, is the experience of being alone that one can inhabit without panic. The quiet room. The hour without another person. The day that passes without conversation, not because it is forced upon you, but because it is sufficient. Solitude is the condition of the interior life. It is what the back room is for. Loneliness is something different. Loneliness, in Fromm's analysis, is not the absence of people. It is the absence of genuine contact. It is possible to be profoundly lonely in a room full of people, in a long marriage, in a career that produces daily interaction with dozens of colleagues. What makes it loneliness is not the number of people present, but the quality of the meeting, or its absence. He had something more to say about loneliness than this distinction. We are not there yet. We will come back to it later in the night, when the hour is quieter and the thought can land differently. For now, let it rest as a question. When you have felt most alone, were you alone or were you surrounded? Let your body settle. Let the question be in the room without requiring an answer. What Fromm was circling in his treatment of loneliness was one of the oldest philosophical problems in the Western tradition, the problem of human separateness. Every human being arrives in the world alone. Every human being will, at the moment of death, be alone. In between, the fundamental condition is one of enclosed interiority. You cannot fully transmit your inner experience to another person. Another person cannot fully enter yours. We are, each of us, sealed within ourselves in a way that no amount of communication fully overcomes. This is not a cause for despair, in Fromm's view, but it is a fact that must be acknowledged before it can be worked with. The response to the fact of separateness is what defines the quality of a human life. In his analysis, some people respond with the attempt to eliminate separateness through fusion, through the symbiotic union he described, the loss of self in another person or a group or a movement. This produces temporary relief and long-term intensification of the problem, because the self that is dissolved into the union has not been eliminated, only suppressed. It will resurface. And when it does, the separateness will feel more acute than before. Other people respond to separateness by numbing it, through work, through activity, through the management of their inner life at such a pace that the awareness of separateness never has time to settle into full view. This also works, for a while, for some people, for most of a lifetime. The problem is that the numbing requires maintenance. And the maintenance has a cost, the same cost as any long performance. Eventually, the question arrives at 2 a.m. when the performance has stopped. The third response is the one Fromm advocated. Not the elimination of separateness, and not the numbing of it, but the genuine meeting of two separate people who remain separate. The contact that is real, precisely because neither person has dissolved into the other. The love that does not require the disappearance of the self as its condition. This, he believed, was the only form of love that could sustain itself. Because it was the only form built on what was actually there. The night is quiet. Let it be quiet. We will come back to loneliness. Chapter 20. The Lens Grinder. In the winter of 1670, in a small rented room in The Hague, a man was grinding glass. His name was Baruch Spinoza. He was 37 years old. 14 years earlier, in 1656, he had been formally excommunicated from the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, the community of his birth, the only world he had known, by a ceremony of extraordinary severity. The herem, the formal curse, named his abominable heresies and monstrous deeds without specifying what they were. The doors of the synagogue closed behind him. Every member of the community was forbidden from speaking to him, from reading his words, from coming within 6 feet of him. He did not argue, he did not appeal, he changed his first name from the Hebrew Baruch to the Latin Benedictus, both mean blessed, and started over. By 1670, he had become the most dangerous philosopher in Europe. His theological political treatise, published anonymously that year, was immediately placed on the index of prohibited books. Critics called him an atheist, an enemy of religion, a man who had turned the universe into a cold and meaningless machine. His neighbors in The Hague knew him as a quiet, precise craftsman who ground optical lenses for microscopes and telescopes, and who sometimes forgot to eat. Let your breath be slow. Let the room be simply dark. Spinoza was working. In the evenings after the lens grinding was done, on the book that would be published after his death. He called it Ethics. He wrote it in the form of geometric proofs, definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations. Because he believed that the nature of reality, including the nature of human emotion and human freedom, could be demonstrated with the same rigor one applied to the properties of triangles. The argument of the ethics is long and dense, but its application to the question Fromm was asking is precise. Spinoza believed that an emotion, a passion, in his terminology, ceases to be a passion the moment you form a clear picture of it. The suffering that comes from an unexamined feeling is the suffering of being controlled by something you do not understand. The moment you see it clearly, name it precisely, understand how it came to be present in you, the control changes. You are no longer the person to whom the emotion happens. You are the person who understands the emotion. He wrote in the fifth part of the Ethics, "An emotion which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it." Fromm read Spinoza carefully. He recognized in this proposition something he had observed repeatedly in his consulting room. The patient who could describe their anger, not vent it, not perform it, but describe it with precision, naming its origin and its structure and its object, was already in a different relationship with it than the patient who could only experience it. Description requires the ability to stand slightly apart from the experience, to have enough distance to see it. This is exactly the quality of attention that Fromm called the precondition for love, the ability to see what is actually there rather than what the unexamined emotion insists is there. Spinoza did not ask for this ability as a one-time act. He was describing a practice, the continuous, patient, careful examination of one's inner states as they arise. The work of a lifetime, the work of the quiet room and the lens and the small light. He also wrote, at the very end of the Ethics, in what is perhaps the most honest closing line in the history of philosophy, "All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare." He died in 1677. He was 44 years old. His landlord found him early one Sunday morning. The window in the small room was open. The lenses were arranged on the workbench. Something in the quiet life is still catching light. Spinoza's Ethics is organized around a definition of God that most of his contemporaries found incomprehensible and most of his critics found heretical. He defined God as identical with nature, not a creator separate from creation, but the totality of what exists, infinite in its attributes, self-caused and necessary. Deus sive natura, God or nature. What this meant for the question of love, of human connection, of the capacity for genuine meeting, was this. The love that Fromm was describing was not, for Spinoza, a sentiment or a feeling or even a practice. It was a form of knowledge, the love of the understanding for what it understands, the knowledge of oneself as part of the whole, as a particular expression of the same substance that underlies everything. This sounds abstract. It becomes concrete in the moment when you look at another person. Really look with the quality of attention that Weil called the rarest and purest form of generosity, and recognize in them not a mirror of your own needs, but a distinct and irreducible existence. The person who is completely themselves, as you are completely yourself, and in whose existence you are, briefly and without losing your own, genuinely interested. That is Spinoza's amor intellectualis put into everyday terms. The love that understands what it loves. Chapter 21. what discipline is not. Karen Horney's patience, and Fromm's and Rogers', and the patience of nearly every analyst who worked in the mid-20th century shared a common feature in their relationship to self-improvement. They were working very hard. They were not lazy people. They had read the books, had attended the lectures, had understood intellectually what was being asked of them, and they were applying themselves to the task of becoming better with the same energy and conscientiousness they brought to everything else in their lives. And it was not working. The reason it was not working, in most cases, was that they were applying effort in the wrong direction. They were trying to become a different person through willpower, in the same way that one might resolve to clean a room by picking up everything visible and putting it somewhere else. The room looks cleaner. Nothing has actually changed. Let your breath move slowly. Let the room be dark. You do not need to improve anything tonight. Fromm was precise about what discipline was not. It was not the suppression of one's actual nature in favor of a better behaved version. It was not the application of the should, Horney's word, to the interior. It was not the performance of qualities one had not yet developed. He had a particular concern about what he called the marketing character, a character type he believed was especially prevalent in American culture of the 1950s. The marketing character is organized around presenting a self that is desirable in the marketplace of relationships, careers, social belonging. It is constantly monitoring what is valued and adjusting its presentation accordingly. It is very good at appearing to have the qualities that are currently admired. The marketing character is exhausting to inhabit, in Fromm's analysis, because it is not a self, it is a strategy. And strategies, unlike cells, require constant maintenance. The moment the monitoring slips, the presentation begins to show its seams. What Fromm was advocating instead was the cultivation of genuine character, what he called, in man for himself, the productive orientation. The character not of the person who produces a performance of virtue, but of the person who has developed, through practice and time and honest examination, a genuine capacity to love, to create, to engage with reality rather than manage its appearance. Carl Rogers arrived at the same place from the therapeutic direction. He spent decades studying what actually changed people in the consulting room, what separated the patients who transformed over time from the patients who left in the same condition they arrived in. His conclusion was this: people change when they feel genuinely accepted, not when they feel genuinely improved. The paradox Rogers named, "When I accept myself just as I am, then I can change," is the paradox that Fromm was navigating in a different register. The change that matters is not the change produced by willpower, it is the change produced by understanding, by the honest look at what is actually there, without the layer of prosecution that turns the looking into a trial. Discipline, in Fromm's formulation, is not the application of force to the recalcitrant self. It is the building of a practice, regular, daily, unremarkable, that makes the desired quality available over time, not through willpower, through return. The difference is the difference between gripping and holding, between forcing and allowing, between a life organized around what you should become and a life organized around what you are genuinely trying daily to be. Let your mind go where it goes. The practice is already underway. Chapter 22. The Return. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. The thought that has been moving through the night in various forms is this: love is not a state. It is a practice, and practice requires return. Return is the operative word, not arrival, the single moment of achieving something. Return, the repeated, daily, unremarkable movement back toward what matters. The violinist who picks up the instrument each morning. The carpenter who goes back to the joint that does not yet fit. The gardener who returns to the same corner of the same plot season after season, knowing that the work is never finished and not requiring it to be. Carl Rogers, in the years after he left the University of Wisconsin for the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute in La Jolla, California, returned again and again to this question of what makes change possible. What makes the development of genuine capacity for love, for creativity, for the full use of one's faculties actually happen as opposed to being desired? His answer, refined over 40 years of practice, was deceptively simple: the presence of someone who receives you as you actually are. Let your shoulders drop. Let the breath be quiet. What Rogers observed was that the quality of being genuinely received, not evaluated, not improved, not managed, but received, produced a relaxation of the defended self that made honest self-examination possible for the first time. People who had spent years trying to improve themselves through willpower and failing began to change in this quality of being received, not because they had been told something new, because they had finally been seen. Fromm would have said, because, for the first time, someone had given them the attention that Simone Weil called the rarest and purest form of generosity, the full weight of another person's genuine presence without agenda. This is the return that Fromm was advocating in love, not the dramatic return from absence, the reunion, the reconciliation, the renewed declaration, the small return. The ordinary morning when you look up from what you are doing and actually see the person in the room with you. The Tuesday evening when you ask a question that is genuinely about them rather than about your need to hear a particular answer. The moment of setting down whatever you are managing long enough to be present. These moments do not feel like much in the doing of them. They are too small to feel like love in the dramatic sense. But they are, in Fromm's understanding, exactly what love is made of. Not the declaration, the return. The night has passed its midpoint. The room is very quiet now. Let the quiet be enough. There is something worth naming about the specific quality of the return that Fromm was advocating. He was not describing the return of romantic passion, the rediscovery of what was felt at the beginning, the attempt to recover the electricity of the early months. He thought that project was a misunderstanding of what long relationships were for. He was describing something quieter and more durable. He was describing the return of genuine interest, the willingness on the ordinary evening to be actually curious about the person across the table. Not curious in the sense of interrogating them, curious in the sense of holding the question, who is this person in this particular moment of their life? What is the private texture of their day that they may not have offered to anyone else? What are they thinking about underneath the management of the household and the management of the week? This quality of interest, not performed, not obligatory, but genuinely present, was, in his observation, the thing that distinguished relationships in which both people felt seen from relationships in which both people felt managed. The presence of genuine interest communicated something that all the visible care in the world could not. It communicated your particular existence as it actually is right now is interesting to me. Not what you produce, not what you provide. You, Chapter 23, The Narcissism of Need. Fromm was interested in a specific failure mode of care that he observed repeatedly. He called it narcissism, though he used the word carefully and differently from the way it is used colloquially today. Narcissism, in his clinical usage, was not primarily about vanity or self-promotion. It was about a specific limitation of perception, the inability to see another person except through the filter of one's own needs. The narcissistic orientation does not ask, "Who are you?" It asks, "What are you in relation to me? What can you provide? What do you threaten? How do I need you to be in order for me to feel what I need to feel?" This is not always conscious. In fact, it is almost never fully conscious. Most people who organize their relationships around their own needs do not experience themselves as doing so. They experience themselves as loving, caring, devoted. The self-reference is invisible to them. It has been present so long that it no longer registers as a feature of their perception. It simply feels like reality. This is why Fromm thought that the practice of love required as one of its central elements the regular willingness to ask, "Am I seeing this person, or am I seeing what I need them to be?" Let the breath be quiet. Let the eyes behind the lids release their hold on whatever they have been seeing. The question is not prosecutorial, it is honest. And in his experience, the people who were willing to ask it, to sit with the uncertainty it produced, to look at the answer without immediately defending themselves against it, these were the people who gradually developed the capacity to actually see the person in front of them. The moment of genuine seeing, the moment when another person's actual existence registers rather than the version you have constructed, is one of the most disorienting experiences available in a long relationship. Because the actual person is always different from the version you carry in your mind. They are larger, stranger, more complicated, more full of interior life than the image you have built from memory and need. And the disorientation of that seeing is, in Fromm's understanding, not a problem. It is the beginning of genuine love. It is the moment when love stops being about what you know and starts being about what is actually there. William James, in his Principles of Psychology, wrote about what he called the baby universe, the world as experienced by an infant, before differentiation, before the self has been clearly separated from the not-self. All pure sensation undivided. James was describing the beginning of consciousness, but Fromm sometimes invoked the idea in a different register, the capacity to be briefly undivided, to let the boundary between self and other become permeable enough that the other person's existence can enter, is something that genuine love requires and that narcissism prevents. Not the permanent dissolution of the self, the temporary, chosen, returned to opening. This is different from what happens in symbiotic love, where the boundary disappears involuntarily and is never rebuilt. The opening Fromm was describing is controlled. It requires a self that can both open and close, both let in and return to itself. This is why the interior, the back room, the solitude, the self that can exist without audience, is the precondition. You can only open a door that can also close. Fromm observed that the people who had developed this capacity, who could be genuinely open to another person's existence without being subsumed by it, had almost universally spent significant time in their own company. Not lonely time, not isolated time, solitary time, cultivated deliberately, in which they had learned to be the witness of their own inner life rather than its victim. The witness does not prosecute. The witness observes. The witness notes, with some patience and without excessive alarm, what is present, the needs, the fears, the hopes, the various forms of self-reference, and allows this observation to inform how they engage with another person. The difference between the witness and the unobserved self is the difference between a person who can genuinely listen and a person who can only wait for their turn to speak. Chapter 24. What you carry home. There is a particular texture to the end of a long workday that Fromm described in a passage in the Sane Society, published in 1955. He was writing about the experience of attention fatigue, the depletion of the capacity for genuine presence that accumulates over the course of a day organized around production and output and the management of other people's expectations. By the time most people arrive home in the evening, they have been attending for 8 or 10 or 12 hours. Attending to emails, to meetings, to the needs of colleagues or clients or children. Attending, most importantly, to the performance of being competent and responsive and reliably available. This is exhausting in a way that is different from physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of the capacity for genuine presence, the resource that makes real contact possible. And then the evening requires them to be present for the people they love most. Let your body sink a little further into where it rests. Let the weight be where it is. Fromm was not making a moral judgment about people who arrive home depleted. He was making an observation about structure. The structure of most modern lives, as he saw it in the 1950s, and this has not changed in the decades since, is one that systematically depletes the resource most essential for love and does not provide for its replenishment. The result is not that people stop caring about the people they love. The caring remains. But the quality of presence that makes caring expressible, that makes the other person actually feel cared for rather than merely managed, that quality is in short supply by the time dinner needs to be made. The response most people develop reasonably and without bad intention is a kind of rationing. They show up for the moments that feel significant. The crisis, the celebration, the explicit need. They trust that the people who love them understand that the other hours, the hours of tiredness and distraction and preoccupation, are not a failure of love, but a limitation of energy. And they are right. The people who love them usually do understand. But there is a cost to the understanding. The cost is that the understanding accumulates over years into a relationship organized around significant moments and ordinary absences. A relationship in which genuine presence is a special event rather than the texture of daily life. Fromm wanted something different. He wanted, for himself and for the people he worked with, the daily, ordinary presence, not the performance of it, not the heroic effort of it, on the nights when the effort is simply not available. But the gradual building of a life in which the depletion was less, in which the practice of attention was distributed through the day rather than held in reserve for the significant moments, in which coming home meant returning to a practice already underway rather than summoning a capacity from nothing. This was ambitious. He knew it, but he had seen it achieved, partially imperfectly, as all achievements in this territory are, by enough people that he believed it was possible rather than merely ideal. The ordinary Tuesday, the unremarkable evening, the 10 minutes before sleep. These are not the margins of love. In Fromm's understanding, they are the center of it. He thought that the separation between the significant and the ordinary was itself a symptom of the having mode, the tendency to reserve the full self for the moments that seem to count and to coast through the rest. The problem with this logic is that the rest is most of a life. The ordinary Tuesday is not the exception, it is the rule. And a love practiced only in the exceptional moments is a love that is not, in practice, much practiced at all. He was not advocating for constant intensity. He was advocating for something softer and more sustainable. The quality of being quietly available, present without performance, attending without effort, because the practice of attending has over time become what one naturally does. Chapter 25. The Art in the Dark. When Fromm used the word art, he was invoking a specific tradition. He was writing in a period when the division between art and craft was well established but not yet complete. He remembered from his childhood in Frankfurt the word Kunst, the German word that covers both art and skill, that does not yet separate what is made beautifully from what is made well. A Künstler was an artist. A Kunstwerk was a work of art. But the word carried in it the older meaning of knowing how the skilled practitioner, the master of a craft. He was invoking that older meaning in the title of his book. The art of loving was not the art of love as sentiment or gesture. It was the art of love as craft, the thing that takes years to learn, that is never fully mastered, that produces something real and lasting through the discipline of daily return. Every painter knows the ugly phase of a painting, the point at which the forms have been established, but the colors are wrong, the composition is not yet resolved, the whole thing looks worse than it did before the attempt began. The painter who does not know the ugly phase is not a painter yet. The painter who knows it, who has been through it enough times to trust that it is a phase and not a verdict, is someone who can keep working. Let your breath be slow. The night is generous with time. There is no hurry. Long relationships have an ugly phase. Most long relationships have several. The early electricity has settled. The accommodation that was easy in the first years has become familiar enough to be assumed. The particular silences that accumulate between two people, the things that have never quite been said, the small resentments that have never quite been named, begin to have a presence in the room. This is not failure. In Fromm's view, this is the beginning of the actual work. The falling in love phase is not nothing, it is real, and it produces a genuine opening, and it should be valued for what it is. But it is not the painting, it is the sketch. The painting begins when the sketch has faded, and what remains is two people and the question of what they will make of each other over time. The painter who trusts the process keeps working. The painter who needs the result to be beautiful now abandons the canvas at the ugly phase. Fromm observed that most relationship failures were not failures of love exactly, they were failures of patience, the third element he had named, alongside discipline and concentration. The refusal to pass through the ugly phase. The conviction that if love were real, it would not produce such difficulty. The escape when the difficulty arrived, toward the next beginning where the sketch would again be fresh. He was not arguing that all difficult relationships should be maintained. He was making a structural observation. The beginning, in this as in all arts, is the easiest part. The middle, the long, unglamorous, often unremarkable middle, in which the actual work happens, is where the practice is required. And the practice is what most people have never been taught. Rilke, in his Letters to a Young Poet, written to Franz Capus in 1903, put it this way: "I would like to beg you, as much as I can, to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves." He was writing about the young man's questions about art. But Fromm, reading Rilke in Mexico in the 1950s, would have recognized the same counsel for the questions that arrive at the ugly phase of a long relationship. Love the questions, not because the questions will produce answers you can carry, but because the questions, honestly held, are what the art requires. Fromm also noticed that the ugly phase of a relationship, the period after the initial electricity has settled and before the deeper form of connection has been built, was often described by his patients as a failure of the man's relationship, as evidence that what they had thought was love was actually something less. They would say, "We used to be so close, and now we are just two people living together. He did not share this diagnosis. He thought that just two people living together was the beginning, not the end of the real work. The electricity was not love. It was the opening condition for love, the possibility. What came after? The ordinary days, the accumulated silences, the gradual discovery of who the other person actually was, without the heightened quality of novelty. This was where the art either appeared or didn't. The painter who abandoned a canvas at the ugly phase never found out what was on the other side of it. Fromm had not abandoned many canvases. He was patient with the ugly phase. He had learned to be. Chapter 26. Kierkegaard and the direction of things. In 1843, Søren Kierkegaard published Either or in Copenhagen under a pseudonym. He was 30 years old. He had recently ended his engagement to Regine Olsen, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life, that he wrote about indirectly in almost everything he produced. He had broken the engagement. He had spent years asking himself why. The book was enormous, 2 volumes, 1,500 pages in the original, and its argument was simple in outline. Human life, Kierkegaard proposed, can be lived in 2 modes. The aesthetic mode, organized around pleasure and experience and the avoidance of boredom, and the ethical mode, organized around commitment and the willing assumption of responsibility for one's choices. He did not think the 2 modes were equal, but he also did not think the movement from one to the other could be commanded. It had to be chosen, and the choice required a particular courage, the willingness to accept the anxiety that came with genuine commitment, the willingness to choose without certainty about how the choice would turn out. He wrote in his journals that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Let the breath be slow. Let the eyes release what they are holding. This sentence has become one of the most quoted things he ever wrote. Fromm would have connected it directly to his own argument. The person who is waiting to understand their relationship before committing to it, waiting to be certain about the outcome before investing in the practice, is trying to live forwards by understanding backwards. It cannot be done. The understanding, such as it is, comes only through the living, through the commitment made without certainty, through the practice engaged with before its results are visible. Kierkegaard also wrote, in The Concept of Anxiety, that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. He meant something precise by this. Anxiety arises not from danger, but from possibility. The person standing at the edge of a choice, the genuine choice, the kind that cannot be undone, experiences a vertigo that is not about what might go wrong. It is about what might go right, and whether they can bear the weight of that too. The anxiety of love is the dizziness of freedom. The anxiety of genuine commitment is the same vertigo. It is the experience of standing at the place where one person must choose, without guarantee, to invest themselves in another. Rilke, writing to Franz Capus in Letters to a Young Poet, asked the young man to be patient toward all that is unsolved. He was describing the same condition from a different angle. The unsolved is not a problem to be eliminated. It is the condition of genuine engagement with anything worth engaging with. A problem with a known solution is an exercise. A life with a guaranteed outcome is not a life in which anything real was chosen. Fromm read both men. He thought they were describing something that his clinical work confirmed: the willingness to accept uncertainty as the permanent condition of genuine love is not a defect in love. It is its structure. Love that requires certainty before it will commit is love organized around fear rather than around the freely given act. And the freely given act, uncertain as it is the only kind worth giving. Kierkegaard broke his engagement to Regine Olsen and spent the next decade writing indirectly about why he never gave a fully satisfying account. He offered several accounts, and they contradicted each other. This may have been the most honest thing he did in relation to that event, to acknowledge that the reasons were multiple and not fully coherent, and that the act was done, and that what remained was to live forward from it without the comfort of a single, clean narrative. Fromm thought this was the condition of every genuine choice: uncertain motive, irreversible action, the forward movement into a future that the understanding which works backwards cannot yet illuminate. Let the night hold what it holds. We are getting closer to the answers we planted earlier. Chapter 27. The two questions answered. We planted two questions earlier in the night. Do you practice or do you wait? Do you attend or do you merely occupy? We are here now. The hour is quiet and the ground is prepared. Fromm spent his career circling these questions from different directions. The answers he arrived at were not dramatic. They were almost disappointingly ordinary. But ordinariness was for him the point. On the first question, do I practice or do I wait? The answer, in his analysis, is almost always that we wait. We wait for love to arrive. We wait for the right person, the right moment, the right configuration of lives that will produce the feeling we are looking for. We wait in the having mode for the acquisition that will resolve the question of love once and for all. He did not blame people for waiting. He understood the logic. Every story we have been told points toward waiting. Every romantic tradition in the culture we inhabit is organized around the moment of arrival rather than the practice of return. We are taught to recognize love by its intensity, not by its consistency, by its electricity, not by its daily texture. Let your breath be slow. This is the part that matters. The movement from waiting to practicing is not a single decision. It is a gradual reorganization of attention. The question is not, how can I love better? Which is still a question organized around outcome, around getting love right. The question is, what am I actually doing right now in this relationship, and is it practice? Practice, in his formulation, looks like this: the choice to look up from what you are doing when the other person enters the room. The choice to ask a question that is genuinely curious rather than rhetorically safe. The choice to say the true thing rather than the comfortable thing. The choice to stay in the difficult conversation rather than managing it toward its close. the choice to return, after the failure of attention, without drama, to the practice of attending again. These are small. They happen in seconds. They happen dozens of times in a day, or they don't happen, and the day is slightly different depending on whether they happened or not. Accumulated over years, the difference between a life of practice and a life of waiting becomes visible. On the second question, do I attend or do I merely occupy? Attending means the actual placement of the full self on what is in front of you, on the person, on their actual words, their actual face, their actual mood, which may not match your expectation of what their mood should be. Attending means letting what is real register, even when what is real is inconvenient or surprising or different from what the having mode expects. Merely occupying means being in the same space as another person while your attention is elsewhere, in your own concerns, in the management of the conversation, in the planning of what you will say next, in the monitoring of how you are appearing. Merely occupying is not a failure of love. It is simply the default, the place the mind goes when it has not been trained to go elsewhere. The training is the practice. These two questions, answered now, do not demand that you change anything tonight. They ask only that you have heard them. In the morning, in the ordinary light, they will be there again. Quieter than they are now, asking less urgently, but present. That is enough. Let them rest. Chapter 28, The Letter He Never Sent. If your mind has been wandering, come back gently. You do not need to have followed every word. The parts that matter will find you. There is a story that is probably not true and that is useful for that reason. Sometime in the early 1960s, the story goes, Fromm was preparing to send a letter to a former patient. He had been thinking about the patient for weeks. The patient had left his practice several years earlier, had moved to another city, had married. Fromm had heard, indirectly, that the marriage was not going well. He wrote a long letter. He did not send it. He thought he understood why the marriage was difficult, and he thought he knew what the patient needed to hear, and he sat with the letter for several days and then did not send it. He described this, or something like it, in a letter to a colleague without identifying the patient. He said, I did not send it because I realized that what I had written was about what I needed to say rather than what he needed to hear. I had confused my desire to be useful with genuine attention to the situation. The letter, on reflection, was written to a version of the patient I had constructed from memory rather than to the person he had become in the years since I had known him. This is what Fromm called the confusion of care and projection. The belief that you know what someone else needs, organized not around their actual existence, but around your accumulated idea of them. Let your breath be quiet. The body is already resting. Let the mind follow. He destroyed the letter. This was, in his view, an act of love more genuine than the sending would have been. Not because destruction is inherently loving, but because the willingness to recognize that your care is organized around your own need rather than another person's actual reality, and to act on that recognition rather than defend against it, is the exercise exactly the quality that makes genuine love possible. The love that projects is not, for all its warmth and all its good intention, actually aimed at the beloved. It is aimed at the version of the beloved that the lover carries internally. It is, in Fromm's clinical language, a form of the narcissistic orientation, not in the popular sense of selfishness, but in the structural sense of the inability to see another person except through the lens of one's own. The two kinds of love are this: love organized around what you know and need, versus love organized around what is actually present and growing. The first is more comfortable. It requires less willingness to be surprised. It involves less uncertainty. It can be maintained without the unsettling experience of genuinely meeting the other person, which always involves discovering that they are more than your idea of them. The second is harder. It requires the willingness to let what you know be updated by what is. To be, regularly and without defensiveness, a student of the person you have chosen. Fromm destroyed the letter and did not write another one. He did not know what the patient needed now. He had not spoken to him in years. His knowing was out of date. The acknowledgement of that, the simple, humble acknowledgement that genuine care requires current knowledge, not archived knowledge, was, in his understanding, the moment the love became real. Chapter 29. The Only Sane Answer. There is a sentence in The Art of Loving that Fromm returned to many times in his subsequent writing and speaking. He said that he had not planned for it to become central, but it was the sentence most people quoted back to him, and he thought that was because it named something that people recognized without having been able to say. The sentence is this: love is the only sane and satisfactory answer to the problem of human existence. He did not mean this sentimentally, he meant it analytically. He had spent 30 years examining the alternatives. He had watched people organize their lives around achievement, around accumulation, around the management of status, around the numbing of experience, around the various forms of escape that he had catalogued in escape from freedom. He had watched these alternatives produce comfort and sometimes satisfaction and occasionally genuine excellence. He had never watched them produce the sense of having arrived somewhere real. The problem of human existence, as he named it, is the problem of separateness. Every human being is enclosed in their own interiority. Every human being will die alone. In between, the fundamental condition is isolation, modified by language, by culture, by the shared forms that give human life its social texture, but never fully overcome. Let your breath be slow. Let the night be simply dark and quiet around you. The alternatives to love, as solutions to separateness, have a common defect. They are organized around the self, around the self's achievements, the self's pleasures, the self's escape from the awareness of its own limits. They produce more self, not less. And more self, more of the enclosed interiority, more of the experience of being the subject, looking out at a world that remains object, is not the answer to the problem of separateness. It is its intensification. Love, in his understanding, is the one human capacity that moves genuinely in the other direction. Genuine love, not the symbiotic union, not the managed possession, not the projection of need, but the real meeting of two separate people who remain separate, is the experience of transcending the self without dissolving it, of being in genuine contact with another existence without losing one's own. This is what he meant by sanity. Sanity for Fromm was not the absence of symptoms, it was the presence of genuine connection to oneself, to others, to the world. The person who has developed the capacity for love in this full sense is, in his analysis, the person who has solved, as much as it can be solved, the fundamental problem of being human. He was clear that this was a high standard. He was also clear that he had seen it achieved, imperfectly and partially and in ordinary people without special gifts, often enough to believe it was not utopian. The meeting, the genuine meeting of two people, does not require perfection. It requires honesty and patience and the willingness to return. It requires the practice. And the practice, unlike the arrival, is available at any moment. It is available now, in this quiet room, in this dark hour, in the simple fact of being present with what is. Fromm thought that this was the most important thing he knew. After 40 years of practice, after 12 books, after the consulting room in New York and the one in Cuernavaca, and the lectures and the interviews and the long conversations with students who stayed too late, the most important thing he knew was this: the capacity for genuine contact with another human being is the most valuable thing a person can develop. More valuable than talent, more durable than achievement, more sustaining than security. Because it is the answer to the question that underlies all the other questions. Not the question of what to do with a life, the question of what a life is for. Chapter 30, What Mature Love Looks Like. He was asked many times to describe what mature love looked like in practice, in ordinary life, not in philosophical abstraction. His answer was always disappointing to people who expected something luminous, because what he described was profoundly ordinary. He described two people at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, not a special Tuesday. A Tuesday in the middle of a life, with whatever the life contained, children or no children, careers or not, the particular accumulation of the years they had built together. One person is reading the newspaper, the other is making coffee. There is nothing remarkable about the scene. What distinguishes the scene in which mature love is present from the scene in which it is not, Fromm said, is almost invisible from the outside. It is in the quality of the morning's texture. Whether the silence between the two people is the silence of comfortable presence or the silence of mutual absence. Whether the small exchanges, the question about the day, the comment about something in the paper, the moment of eye contact over the rim of the cup are genuine or performed. Whether each person is actually in the room or elsewhere. Let your breath slow. Let the room be dark and still. He also described conflict, because he was clear that mature love was not the absence of conflict. It was the ability to have conflict without destroying what was between the two people. The ability to disagree, to be frustrated, to name what was not working, and to return, after the conflict, to the practice of genuine attention. He thought the return was the most important part. The conflict was not the test. The return was the test. Whether, after the difficulty, both people were willing to come back to the practice. To acknowledge, without drama, that the conflict had happened and that it was now over and that the work continued. This quality of return, the willingness to come back after frustration and distance and the ordinary failures of two imperfect people trying to be genuinely present for each other, was, in his view, the most precise indicator of whether what was between two people was mature love or something organized around more volatile foundations. He also said that mature love was recognizable by a particular quality of ease. Not the ease of never being challenged, not the ease of everything working smoothly, the ease of not performing. Of being in the presence of someone who has seen you as you actually are and has chosen with that knowledge to stay. Of being known rather than managed. This quality, the ease of being known, was, in his clinical experience, the most frequently reported experience of people who described their relationships as genuinely loving. Not the excitement, not the security, not the practical benefits, the ease, the relief of the performance suspended, the kitchen on Tuesday morning, the unremarkable coffee, the comfortable silence, or the genuine exchange. This is what it looks like. It is almost too ordinary to see. Fromm noticed that when he described mature love in these terms, in the terms of the ordinary Tuesday, the unremarkable morning, the ease of being known, people often reacted with a kind of disappointment. They had expected something more. Something that announced itself, something with the quality of arrival rather than the quality of continuation. He understood the disappointment. The culture had been educating people for their entire lives in the drama of love, the declaration, the reunion, the grand gesture. The ordinary Tuesday was not what the love songs had prepared them for. But the ordinary Tuesday, he said, was where most of a life actually happened. And the love that was present in the ordinary Tuesday, the willingness to look up, to ask the real question, to be actually in the room with the person rather than merely sharing the space with them, was the form of love that made a life feel inhabited. That made the years feel like they had been spent in genuine contact with another human being, rather than in the elaborate parallel management of two separate interiors. He had watched people arrive at the end of long relationships, through death, through separation, through the ordinary endings of lives, and describe what they most valued from those relationships. It was almost never the grand occasions. It was the Tuesday mornings, the Saturday afternoons, the particular quality of silence they had learned together, the ordinary, repeated, unremarkable quality of genuine presence. That was what they named. Chapter 31, The Descent. The sentences are shorter now. This is not an accident. Fromm knew about the shape of the night. He knew that the hour after midnight is different from the hour before. The mind at this point, in the long arc of a sleepless dark, is not the same mind that was listening 3 hours ago. It has travelled somewhere, not through argument, through accumulation. The accumulation is this: love is not what arrives, it is what is practiced. The practice requires 3 elements: discipline, concentration, patience. Not in their popular meanings, in their deeper ones. The discipline that builds a capacity rather than punishing a failure. The concentration that places the full self on what is real rather than managing the appearance of attention. The patience that allows development to proceed at the pace it requires. Let the breath slow. Let the body be heavy. The practice is organized against the having mode, against the accumulation of love as possession, against the management of the other person's existence in the service of your own needs, against the performance of care that is organized around how care looks rather than what it does. The practice requires, as its precondition, the interior, the back room, the self that can be alone without panic, that can examine its own states without prosecution, that can sit in the quiet without immediately filling it. And the interior requires, as its condition, the honest look, not the should, not the assessment of how far you fall short of the ideal, but the clear, undramatic, uncritical inventory of what is actually present, what you feel, what you need, what you are giving, what you are taking. These things are connected. They form a single architecture. The having mode and the being mode are not abstract philosophical categories. They are descriptions of how attention moves, moment by moment, through the ordinary hours. The person in the having mode is tracking, accumulating, protecting. The person in the being mode is present, attending, engaged with what is actually there. Both are possible. Both are practiced in different proportions by almost everyone. The question is not which mode is entirely absent, but which mode is more fully inhabited in the moments that matter. The moments that matter are not the dramatic ones, they are the small ones. The ones that happen too quickly to be chosen consciously unless the practice has made the better choice available. The back room makes the practice possible. The practice makes the meeting possible. The meeting, the genuine contact between two separate people who remain separate, is the answer to the problem of separateness that Fromm called the only sane and satisfactory one. It is not a complete answer. No human answer to a fundamental problem is complete. But it is the direction. And the direction, Fromm believed, was what he could offer, not the destination. The way of walking. The architecture holds together because it is not built on argument, but on observation. Fromm did not invent a philosophy of love and then try to make the evidence fit. He spent 4 decades listening to what people actually experienced in love, its textures, its failures, its occasional arrivals at something genuine, and then described what he saw. What he saw was the same structure appearing again and again in different lives, in different languages, across different decades. The people who had developed the capacity for genuine love shared the interior. They had built the back room. They had, through solitude or suffering or deliberate practice, and usually through some combination of all three, arrived at a relationship with themselves that was honest and unhurried and not organized around how they appeared. From that ground, the meeting of two people became possible. The meeting was not permanent. It required the daily return. It required the willingness to keep practicing when the practice produced no immediate reward. It required, in Kierkegaard's terms, the movement forward without the clarity of backward understanding. This is what love requires. This is what has always been required. The night has named it. Chapter 32. What can still be learned? Fromm published The Art of Loving when he was 56. He was not writing for young people, exactly, though young people have always been among its readers. He was writing for the person who has been attempting love in various forms for a long time, who has made mistakes, sustained losses, built and lost and rebuilt, who is somewhere in the middle of a life and is asking without urgency whether what they are doing constitutes the thing they have been trying to do. His answer, the implicit answer of the book, was, "You are still in time." Not because the clock is still running, not as a reassurance against mortality, but because the practice of love has no age limit, no prerequisite of youth, no window that closes. The person at 70 who begins to build the interior has not missed anything essential. They have arrived at the work later than they might have. The work remains available. Let your breath be slow. The room is very quiet. William James, who spent the first 30 years of his adult life in a depression that no one would have recognized as such because it was so completely functional, teaching, writing, building the field of American psychology from a studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts, emerged from it in his mid-40s into a period of remarkable productivity and genuine equanimity. He did not solve the depression. He arrived, through the practice of turning his attention deliberately toward what was livable rather than what was not, at a relationship with his own mind that made the depression coexist with a functional, even joyful life. He was not young when he figured this out. Montaigne retired to his tower at 38. The essays he produced from that retirement, the ones that Fromm read in Mexico and recognized as describing the project of the interior, were written over 20 years. The early ones are different from the late ones. The early ones are still partly performed. By the late essays, something has settled. The voice has arrived somewhere. Boethius wrote The Consolation of Philosophy in 524 from a cell in Pavia, awaiting execution by order of Theodoric. He had been one of the most powerful men in the late Western Roman Empire. Magistrate, senator, philosopher. He had been imprisoned on charges that were, by most historical accounts, fabricated. He had nothing left, no power, no status, no future. He was 50 years old, approximately, and he had the conversation with Lady Philosophy that he recorded. And the conversation is still being read 1,500 years later. You are still in time. The second kind of tiredness, the tiredness of having practiced love in ways that did not quite work for longer than you can clearly remember, is not evidence that the work is finished. It is evidence that the work has been underway, and work that has been underway can be redirected, can be informed by what has not worked, can be improved by the honest look at what was practice and what was waiting. This is what Fromm wanted his readers to hear. Not a prescription for beginning again, a description of what is still possible. The description is not comfortable in the sense of being easy to receive. It asks something. It asks the willingness to look at what has been practiced and what has been merely performed, and to see the difference honestly. To acknowledge, without excessive self-prosecution, the distance between where the practice actually is and where it was imagined to be. But the description is also, in its own way, generous, because it is predicated on the belief that the person reading it, the person lying awake in the dark, carrying whatever they are carrying, has the capacity for the genuine thing, has already demonstrated it in moments, however partial, and can, if willing to engage the practice rather than simply desire the result, develop it further. This is not small. This is the whole argument. Chapter 33. What Fromm said about loneliness. Earlier in the night we planted a question. We said that Fromm had more to say about loneliness than the simple distinction between loneliness and solitude. We said we would come back to it when the hour was quieter. The hour is quieter now. Here is what he said. Loneliness, in Fromm's analysis, is not the absence of people. The experience of loneliness that is most pervasive in modern life is not the loneliness of the isolated individual, though that exists and is genuinely painful. It is the loneliness of the person who is surrounded, the loneliness of the person in the crowded room, the loneliness of the long marriage, the loneliness of the full calendar, and the life that looks, from the outside, like it lacks nothing. This loneliness is produced not by the absence of people, but by the absence of genuine contact, by the accumulation of exchanges that move across the surface without penetrating it, by the years of managing appearances and maintaining performances and occupying the same space as other people without ever quite meeting them. Let your breath be slow. Let the room be quiet. He thought this loneliness was one of the central pathologies of modern industrial society. He thought the market economy, which organized human beings primarily as producers and consumers, had generated a set of values and a set of behaviors that were radically incompatible with genuine contact. Everything was commodified, not just objects and services, but personality, relationship, attention itself. People presented themselves on the market of social life as commodities with features and benefits, and evaluated others through the same lens. In a world organized this way, genuine contact, the meeting of two people who are genuinely present with each other, without transaction, without management, without the filter of what each can provide the other, becomes not just difficult, but structurally counterintuitive. It runs against the grain of how everything else in the culture is organized. This is why Fromm thought the practice of love was, in a meaningful sense, a radical act, not political radicalism, the quieter, more durable radicalism of simply deciding to be present with another person, of deciding that the exchange you are about to have with someone you love will not be organized around what you need to get from it, but around what is actually there. Hannah Arendt, who had thought harder than almost anyone about the relationship between the public and the private, the political and the personal, observed in the human condition that the only adequate response to the fact of plurality, the fact that human beings are irreducibly different from each other, that no one's existence fully coincides with anyone else's, is action in the presence of others, not action upon others. Action in the presence of them, seen by them, received by them as the particular person one is. This is a different description of what Fromm meant by the meeting. The meeting is the moment in which your particular existence, not the role, not the competence, not the accumulated performance, registers with another particular existence. The loneliness that Fromm was diagnosing is the loneliness of the particular self that has never been met, that has been used, appreciated, depended upon, organized around, but not met. The cure, in his understanding, was not the addition of more people. It was the deepening of the quality of contact with the people who are already present. One genuine meeting is worth 100 managed ones. The night has provided the conditions for this understanding. Let it settle. Chapter 34. Frankfurt. The lamp still burning. It is 1956 again. The study in Frankfurt. The lamp on the wooden desk. He has been writing for months. The book is nearly done. He will finish it this winter, and it will be published in the spring, and within a year it will have been translated into 12 languages, and he will receive letters from people in all of those languages saying that he has named something they had been unable to name. He does not know this yet. He is still in the middle of it. Let your body be heavy. The breath is quiet and slow. The night has nearly run its course. He puts down his pen and looks out the window. The city is dark, or as dark as cities go. He is 56 years old. He has been married 3 times. He has known loss and exile and the particular loneliness of the intellectual who lives between worlds, between Frankfurt and New York and Mexico, between German and English and Spanish, between the Jewish tradition he carries and the secular humanism he has constructed from it. He has also known love. He will say later in interviews that his 3rd marriage to Annis Freeman was the one in which he most fully understood what he had been writing about, that the practice he had spent his career describing was not something he had achieved cleanly, but something he had approached imperfectly over time. He is honest about the imperfection. It is one of the things that makes the book trustworthy. The lamp is still on in the room. The pages are in order. Outside, the winter is cold but not severe. There is no dramatic moment. There is only a man, late in the evening, having spent months thinking carefully about one of the oldest human questions, sitting with the satisfaction of work that has been done as well as he can do it. He does not think the book is a masterpiece. He thinks it is true. In his experience, which was considerable, true is rarer than masterpiece and harder to achieve. Masterpieces require talent. Truth requires the willingness to say what is actually there, even when it is less beautiful than what you could construct, even when it implicates you, even when it is more ordinary than the reader might want. He turns off the lamp. The room does not answer. He sleeps. But before he does, in the few minutes between the lamp going dark and the arrival of sleep, he lets himself think about what the book is actually doing, what it is for. It is not for the people who already know how to love. Those people, in his experience, did not need him. What they had arrived at through their own work and their own suffering and the particular grace of having been taught by someone or by life how to inhabit the practice. They were not a large group, but they existed. The book was for the others, the much larger group of people who had tried, sincerely and with genuine desire, to build a loving life and had found themselves, at some point in the attempt, in the position of not understanding what they had been doing wrong. Who had arrived at the question not through failure of feeling, but through the absence of instruction. Who had brought everything they had to the effort and had still found something missing. For those people, he wanted to offer something specific. Not comfort, exactly. Not reassurance, but precision. The word for what was missing. The name for what the practice required. The understanding that the absence was not evidence of deficiency, but of a particular kind of education that the culture had never provided. He wanted to give them the map. And then, in his experience, most people were perfectly capable of finding their own way. Chapter 35. The Final Question. He said, in the end, one more thing. He said it differently in different books, in different interviews, in different conversations, but it came to the same thought each time. He said that love is an act of faith, not in the religious sense, though he was interested in the territory of religious experience, had written about it carefully, thought the mystical traditions, East and West, were pointing at something real, in the simpler sense, the sense in which you commit to the practice without certainty about the outcome, the sense in which you return on the ordinary day to the person you have chosen, without knowing whether the returning will be received as it is meant. This requires a specific kind of courage. He called it rational faith, the faith that is not blind but that has been considered, the faith of the person who has examined what they believe and why, who has tested their convictions against experience, and who has arrived at a committed position not in spite of the uncertainty but through it. Let the breath slow. The room is dark. Nothing is required of you. The rationality of this faith is in the evidence, not proof. Love does not offer proof, but the evidence of one's own experience, examined honestly, the moments of genuine contact that have been possible, the times when the practice, maintained through the ordinary hours, produced something that waiting could never have produced. The quality of ease that arrived unexpectedly in a Tuesday morning that asked nothing of anyone. He thought that most people had this evidence if they were willing to look for it without the filter of what they had needed it to be. That somewhere in even the most difficult history of attempting love, there had been moments, and those moments were not accidents. They were the results of the practice, even if the practice had been partial and inconsistent and often unconsciously applied. Those moments were what he was asking people to take as their evidence. Not that love would work out, not that the attempt would be rewarded, but that the capacity was real, that it had been present and could be cultivated and could be returned to and would produce in the returning something that organized the life around a different center than the one most people had inherited. The question he wanted to leave at the edge of your attention, not to be answered tonight, but to be there in the morning when the quiet has continued, is this: where, in your experience, is the evidence? Not demanding, not accusing, simply asking, in the dark, where the evidence of your own capacity already lives. Let it rest there. The night knows how to hold it. Fromm was not naive about the difficulty. He had spent 40 years in the consulting room, listening to accounts of the practice in all its imperfection. He had heard about the attempts that stalled, the returns that could not quite reach the other person, the interior that was built and then neglected and had to be built again. He knew the practice was not linear. He knew it involved failure and repetition, and the sometimes uncomfortable discovery that one had been further from the genuine act than one had believed. He also knew that the awareness of this, the honest recognition of where one actually was in the practice, rather than where one preferred to believe one was itself a form of progress. That the person who could see their patterns clearly, without excessive self-prosecution and without defensive avoidance, was already practicing, already doing something different from the person who could not yet look. The evidence is not perfection. The evidence is the honest look, the willingness to hold the question in the dark and wait for what comes. Chapter 36, the close. The sentences are short now. The ideas have been said. Frankfurt, 1956. A lamp. A man who spent his life asking why we struggle to love the way we mean to. His answer? Simple in the end. Because no one showed us it was something to practice. Because we were taught to wait for it to arrive. Because the interior, the back room, the place where the genuine self lives, requires building. And the building is available. It is available now. In this room, in this darkness, in the breath that moves without your managing it. You have not failed at love. You were handed the materials but never shown what to build. That is the line he might have written. That is what tonight has been. Not a lesson. A lamp left on in a quiet room. Let your body be heavy. Let the questions rest where they are. They will be quieter in the morning. Clearer. The practice does not end tonight. It continues in the ordinary morning, in the unremarkable exchange, in the choice, small and repeated and entirely unglamorous, to return. The lamp is still on. Let your mind go where it goes. Sleep now. Curator's note. I keep returning to Fromm because his diagnosis is the quietest kind, the kind that does not accuse, only illuminates. Sometime in the last year, I stopped asking whether I was being loved correctly and started asking whether I had learned to love at all. That question, which arrived without warning, changed everything that followed. This one is for that hour, and for everyone who has found themselves awake in the dark with the same unanswered thing.